The door locked with a sound that echoed through the entire room. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet, deliberate click. The kind of sound that only becomes terrifying once you realize what it means. Maya stood completely still beside the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of conference room 7, her tablet pressed flat against her chest, her pulse doing something she had never felt before. It stopped, then doubled, then stopped again. The meeting had been running for 45 minutes. The investors were still seated. And Ethan Cole, the most powerful man she had ever worked for, had just walked to the door, turned the lock without looking at anyone, turned back around and looked only at her. The investors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Nobody spoke. Because when Ethan Cole changed the energy of a room, the entire world adjusted to match it. Maya had seen this happen 100 times. In boardrooms, in negotiations, in quiet conversations that ended careers. Welcome to Danito Stories. If you're returning, thank you. If you're new, subscribe now. Don't skip. The dramatic part is waiting for you. Because this story is going to reach somewhere inside you. Now let's go. She knew what it felt like to watch someone else sit in the crosshairs of that attention. She had always been the one standing just outside it, invisible, organized, prepared, and invisible again. But not today. He crossed the room in 8 steps, she counted, because her mind does strange things when her body is too afraid to move, and he stopped close enough that she could hear him breathe. Then he leaned in, his voice so low it barely disturbed the air between them. You thought I never noticed. Not a question. A statement. Quiet, precise, and weighted with something she couldn't immediately name. Her world didn't just stop, it reversed. Because for 3 years she had built her entire existence around one silent belief, that he didn't see her, that she was background noise, that her love, contained and never spoken, was completely invisible to the only person it had ever been about. And now he was standing 6 inches from her face, his eyes holding hers, and every assumption she had ever made about her own invisibility was dissolving in real time. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what that whisper meant, you need to understand everything that came before it. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days before that door locked. Maya Chen had taken the assistant position at Cole Industries because it paid 40% more than anything else she had applied for, and because the job description promised challenge without using the word exciting 14 times the way most listings did. She was 28, precise, deeply private, and completely unbothered by the idea of working for a man everyone described the same way: impossible, obsessed with control, brilliant in a way that left no room for anything soft. She had prepared herself for all of that. What she hadn't prepared herself for was the moment she walked into his office on the first morning, and he didn't look up from his desk. Not for 6 full seconds. She'd counted. When he finally did, he handed her a folder and said, "Align the Tokyo meetings with the Singapore window. Don't let them overlap. Don't ask me to explain why," and look back down. No hello. No welcome. No orientation. She had the Tokyo meetings realigned within 11 minutes. She left the updated schedule on the corner of his desk without speaking. And when she returned 20 minutes later, the folder was gone, and there was a new one in its place with a single yellow sticky note on top that said, "Correct." That was the entirety of their first day. And somehow, inexplicably, she had gone home that evening feeling more engaged by her work than she had in years. She was excellent at her job. Everyone noticed it except the person she most wanted to notice. She organized his world with the precision of someone who understood not just what he needed but why he needed it, anticipating conflicts before they formed, smoothing edges before they became walls, and managing the invisible architecture of his days so completely that he could walk through his own schedule like it was effortless. Because for him it was. She made it effortless. And he never once wondered how. That was the first quiet ache. Not that he was unkind. He wasn't, particularly. He was simply absent, present in body, entirely elsewhere in attention. He spoke to her the way he spoke to his calendar application. Brief, transactional, occasionally impressed by efficiency but never curious about the person producing it. She was a function to him. A very effective one. And she told herself every morning that this was fine. That this was professional. That this was what she had signed up for. She told herself this for about 4 months before she understood it wasn't entirely true anymore. It started small. The way these things always do, so small you can dismiss them for a very long time. She started noticing the way he held his coffee before he drank it. Both hands always, even in summer. Like he needed the warmth before he needed the caffeine. She started noticing the way he paused, sometimes in the middle of reading something, and his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with business. Like the words had touched something personal, something he kept behind several locked doors. She noticed that on Friday afternoons, he stayed at his desk 15 minutes longer than necessary, and the way he looked out the window during those 15 minutes suggested not triumph but something more like longing. She stopped dismissing these observations somewhere around month 7. Because by then they had accumulated into something she recognized as understanding. She understood him. Not the billionaire. Not the CEO. Him, the specific, complicated, guarded human being underneath all that performance of power. And understanding someone, truly understanding them, is one of the most dangerous doors in the world. Because once you walk through it, you cannot walk back. She never said any of it out loud. Not to him, not to colleagues, not even to her closest friend Priya, who had learned to read Maya's silences the way other people read faces. She carried it the way she carried everything private, with care, with containment, with the quiet discipline of someone who knew that some things, once released into the world, cannot be returned to the safety of the internal. She told herself it wasn't love, that it was admiration, professional respect. Intellectual fascination with a complex person. She was very convincing. She convinced herself almost completely, except on the days he came close enough that she could smell the faint cedar of his coat, or on the evenings he said, "Good work today," without looking up, and she would drive home replaying those 4 words for the entire 40-minute commute as if they were an entire conversation. Her apartment became a complicated space. Full of ordinary things that were all somehow connected back to him. A book she'd bought because he mentioned its author once in passing. A coffee brand she'd switched to because she'd once watched his expression shift slightly when the office had it versus when it didn't. A playlist she listened to late at night that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the feeling of standing next to someone you love without being able to say a single word about it. She was not miserable. That's the part nobody would believe. Loving someone in silence has its own quiet dignity. It asks nothing of the other person. It takes nothing. It simply exists, patient, private, and very, very deep. But silence is only sustainable for so long before the weight of it starts to show. Ethan Cole had not survived becoming what he was by being unobservant. He was, in fact, furiously observant. He noticed everything in a boardroom. The micro-shift in a negotiator's jaw before they concealed a lie, the half-second of hesitation that meant someone hadn't read the materials, and the room's entire emotional weather system before he'd even taken his seat. He had built an empire on the ability to read what wasn't being said, which made it all the more strange that it took him 2.5 years to really look at Maya. Not look at her the way he looked at an assistant, cataloging function and output. Look at her. The person. It happened in the car. He didn't plan it. He was reviewing a contract on his phone, and the car stopped at a light, and he looked up for no reason at all and caught her reflection in the passenger window. She was staring out at the street, not at anything specific, just looking at the city with an expression he didn't have a name for. Something tired and strong at the same time, the way you look when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and you're not planning to put it down, but you're also completely done pretending it isn't heavy. He looked back at his phone. Then I looked at the window again. She hadn't moved. For the first time in 2.5 years, Ethan Cole felt something deeply uncomfortable. He didn't know what she was thinking. And he realized, with a slowness that surprised him, that he had never tried to know. He had benefited every single day from the fact that she understood him completely and had never once extended the same curiosity in return. The light changed. He looked back at his contract. But the reflection stayed with him for the rest of the day in a way he didn't know how to file, process, or dismiss. That evening, standing at his floor-to-ceiling window in the mansion that was all clean lines and perfect silence, he asked himself a question he hadn't asked in years. When was the last time he had been genuinely curious about another person? He couldn't answer it. The mansion was beautiful in the way that well-designed, emotionally hollow things are beautiful. Everything in its place. Everything is purchased to signal something. Nobody there to signal anything to. He'd worked toward this kind of space, this level of controlled, uninterrupted solitude, for over a decade, and standing in it now felt suddenly less like achievement and more like a very expensive way to be completely alone. He poured a drink he didn't finish. He stood at the window until the city lights blurred at the edges. And he thought, without wanting to think it, about a face reflected in glass, tired and strong and carrying something she would never be asked about. The next few weeks he began doing something he had never done. He started paying attention in a direction other than forward. He asked her how her weekend was. She said, "Good, thank you." Short and polite, the answer of someone who had long ago stopped expecting the question to mean anything. He felt that. She asked for nothing in return. Not because she wasn't curious. He understood now that she was probably the most quietly curious person in any room she entered. But because she had already given up expecting reciprocity from him. He had trained her out of hoping for it. He saw her in the park one evening. He hadn't been looking for her. He'd been walking with nowhere to go, which was new for him and uncomfortable and probably necessary. She was sitting on a bench with her shoes off and her feet pulled up beneath her, reading something on her phone with the kind of complete absorption that meant she was genuinely somewhere else entirely. No office composure. No careful blankness. Just a woman who believed herself to be alone and was therefore completely, visibly herself. He took 2 steps toward her. She looked up. The openness on her face vanished in less than a second, not replaced by coldness, just by the professional distance she maintained around him like a second skin, and she stood up. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice gave nothing. "I didn't mean to interrupt." He said it and realized it was probably the most honest thing he'd said to her in 3 years and also the most pointless, because the interruption had already happened and the moment he'd seen was already gone. She nodded once. Said she was heading home. And he stood next to the bench she'd vacated and understood with sudden, startling clarity that he had no place in her life outside those office walls. She had built her world without any room for him in it. Not out of bitterness. Out of simple, self-preserving honesty. She knew he would never choose to be there, and so she had never left a door open. He found the clinic 3 days later. He wasn't following her. He told himself this several times. He had driven past the neighborhood on the way back from a site visit, noticed a familiar silhouette through the clinic window, and stopped without deciding to. It wasn't surveillance. It was, he didn't have a word for it. Concern maybe. A new, unfamiliar species of concern that had nothing to do with professional performance. He watched through the window for 11 minutes before he understood what he was seeing. She worked there on Saturday afternoons. Not for pay, he would later learn that she volunteered. She was helping an elderly man navigate a form, speaking slowly and patiently, her whole body oriented toward him in the way of someone who is completely present for the person in front of them. When he finished, she touched his arm briefly, reassuring and warm, and called the next person over before she'd even sat back down. She moved through that room like someone who had been there 100 times. She probably had. He had worked alongside this woman for over 2 years. He had spoken to her approximately 5,000 times. He had never once known she was this person on weekends. The guilt that hit him was physical. A tightening in his chest that he identified with some delay as shame. Not the manageable kind, not the kind you file under areas for improvement and schedule a follow-up with yourself about. The raw kind. The kind that comes from seeing someone's full humanity and realizing you chose, every single day, not to see it. She looked up, found him at the window, and her face did something he hadn't expected. It didn't show fear. It showed disappointment. Deep, quiet, unsurprised disappointment. The disappointment of someone who has already long since adjusted their expectations and is simply confirmed in doing so. He walked inside. "You don't belong here," she said. Not unkindly. Not angrily. Just truthfully. For words that cut through every layer of his self-assurance with the precision of something sharpened over the years. He left. Because she was right. And he was beginning to understand that being right about things had never felt this bad before. The Monday after the clinic, he called her into his office. He had prepared something to say. He'd actually written it down, which was something he hadn't done in personal communication since he was 22. He had the words arranged and ready. And then she walked in, calm, professional, carrying her tablet and a stillness that made everything he'd prepared feel immediately insufficient, and he couldn't say any of it. Because the gap between what he had written and what she deserved was so large, he couldn't bridge it with prepared language. He offered her a promotion instead. Director of Executive Operations. 20% pay increase. A private office, a team of her own, and full authority over the schedule she had managed alone for 3 years. She looked at the paper he slid across the desk. She looked at it for a very long time. And then she slid it back. "I appreciate this." Her voice was measured. "But this isn't what I needed from you." He said, "Then what do you need?" The answer came without hesitation. She had clearly already known it for a very long time. "I didn't need your money. I needed your respect. And I needed it 3 years ago when it would have meant something. When I was still hoping you might give it." The past tense hit him harder than anything else in that sentence. Was hoping. Not am. Something had already ended before he understood it had begun. She thanked him for the offer. She left. She was professionally impeccable about all of it. And somehow that impeccability, the fact that she would not even give him the dignity of her anger, was the most devastating part. He sat in his office for a long time after she closed the door. There was a deal on his desk worth $62 million. He didn't touch it. He drove that evening without direction. Just drove, which was something he had never done because directionlessness had always felt to him like a failure of planning. Tonight it felt like the only honest thing available. He replayed her voice in the car's silence. "I needed your respect." Over and over. The way a person replays something they wish they could argue against and simply cannot. When he finally got home, he stood in his kitchen. Marble countertops, professional appliances, a refrigerator stocked by a service he'd never had to think about, and he felt the full, unmedicated weight of his own solitude for the first time. Not the curated version. The real one. The version that existed because he had spent 15 years optimizing his life for achievement and had never once optimized it for connection. He had everything. He sat on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, and understood with complete clarity that everything was absolutely nothing without the one thing he'd never thought to value. She gave 2 weeks' notice by email. Professional, clear, and gracious, she cited pursuing new opportunities, which was true, and thanked him for 3 years of meaningful professional experience, which was generous, and offered a seamless transition, which was characteristic. She CC'd HR. She sent her transition notes before he'd even responded. Everything was handled before he had to be involved. Of course it was. That was who she was. Even when she was walking away from him, she made it easier for him than he deserved. He read the email 4 times. He didn't respond for 6 hours. When he finally did, he wrote 3 different replies and deleted all of them before sending a single sentence. Understood. Thank you. 2 words that said nothing and meant less. He hit send and felt, immediately, that he had just made the smallest possible choice at the largest possible moment. The last day she was in the office, he arrived early. He sat at his desk, looked at the door, and told himself he would go speak to her. Say something real. Say something that mattered. He had the whole morning. He had the afternoon. He had until 6 o'clock when, by his own knowledge of her habits, she would pack her last box and leave without drama. He didn't go. He sat in his office, made 12 phone calls, attended 3 meetings, reviewed 2 contracts, and did not once walk 30 feet down the hallway to say a single word to the person who had organized his entire professional existence for 3 years and was currently leaving it forever. He didn't go because he didn't know what to say. And because not knowing what to say had always, for Ethan Cole, been permission not to speak at all. It was the worst decision he'd ever made, which looked like doing nothing. The next morning her desk was empty. Not cleared in the rushed, messy way of someone who left in anger, pristinely organized, every surface clean, her access badge centered exactly in the middle of the desk blotter, her building key beside it. She had even labeled the pending files for whoever came after her. She had made herself disappear without leaving a single loose end. He stood at her desk for 4 minutes. He didn't know why. There was nothing to look at. That was precisely the point. The absence was total, and he felt it with his entire body, the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. He had filled this space with her for over 3 years without ever once acknowledging what it meant. Now the space was its original size again, and it was enormous. His EA would be temporary for the next 6 weeks while HR searched for a replacement. 7 candidates came in for interviews. He rejected each one within 12 minutes. Not because they were unqualified. Because none of them knew, without being told, to hold the Tokyo calls until after Singapore closed. None of them understood instinctively that the morning reports should be sorted by urgency rather than arrival time. None of them did what she had done, which was to learn him so completely that his professional world ran better than he could have designed it himself. In the 4th week he stopped interviewing. He told HR he was reconsidering the role structure. He was not reconsidering the role structure. He simply could not sit across a desk from someone and explain what he needed, because doing so had forced him to understand for the first time how extraordinary the thing he'd lost actually was. He went back to the clinic. Not on the Saturday she volunteered. He was careful about that, deliberate about it. If you're feeling this story, like and share it so others can find it. Comment where you're watching from now. Back to the story. He went on a Thursday evening when he'd confirmed through the clinic's public schedule that they needed help with administrative intake. He wore nothing that identified him as Ethan Cole, CO. He wore jeans and a plain jacket, and he sat at a folding table and helped people fill out forms for 2 hours. He was bad at it at first. Too efficient. Too direct. He answered questions people hadn't finished asking. He assumed an understanding where people needed patience. By the end of the 2nd hour, he'd learned something he had never needed to learn in any boardroom. Some conversations cannot be finished faster by being smarter. Some conversations require you to slow completely down and sit in another person's pace, in their confusion, in their fear, without resolving it for them, just staying there with them until they find their own way through. He went back the following Thursday. And the Thursday after that. Nobody from his world knew about it. He didn't tell anyone. He wasn't doing it for appearance or narrative or the charitable donation optics that his PR team occasionally suggested. He was doing it because he had spent 15 years becoming extraordinarily competent at everything that was supposed to matter and had just discovered that none of it had actually taught him how to be present for another human being. He was enrolling in a curriculum he was extremely overdue for. The change at the office was slower. More difficult. 15 years of operating as the undisputed authority in every room does not unwind in weeks. But it did begin to unwind. He started holding the space in meetings before he spoke, actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to redirect. He started asking his team questions and meant them. He started acknowledging the invisible work, the coordination, the preparation, the background labor that made everything run. He started saying thank you in ways that meant something. His team noticed. They didn't know what to do with it initially. It takes time to trust a changed person. He understood that now, in a way he hadn't before, understanding it the way you understand something you've caused rather than something you've observed. He did not reach out to Maya. He was very deliberate about this, because reaching out to her now, in these early weeks of change, would have been reaching out for himself, to feel better about the change, to have her witness it. And she wasn't owed that obligation. She wasn't responsible for his growth. She wasn't a mirror for his redemption. She was a person who had already given him 3 years of herself without asking for anything in return, and the least he could offer now was to not make his transformation another thing she had to manage. So he changed quietly, without an audience, without guarantee. And somewhere across the city, in a small good-lit office at a non-profit she'd found 3 weeks after leaving coal industries, Maya Chen was rebuilding something too. The new job suited her in ways the old one hadn't allowed. Not because the work was easier, it wasn't, not particularly, but because for the first time in years she was permitted to be fully visible. Her opinions were asked for and used. Her instincts about people were valued rather than incidental. She had a manager who said, "I notice you do this better than anyone else on the team," and meant it, and the experience of being genuinely seen in a professional context was so unfamiliar that it took her approximately a month to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was good. She'd always known that about herself in a quiet, private way, the way you know things about yourself that you never get to say out loud. Now she was good with an audience. Now her competence was returned to her in the form of acknowledgement, and she discovered that acknowledgement, while not everything, is nothing either. She didn't think about Ethan every day. That was progress. She thought about him on certain kinds of evenings, the city-lit, late fall kind where the air has a quality that belongs to no particular season, and your mind drifts toward things unresolved. She thought about the cedar smell of his coat and the way he held his coffee with both hands. She thought about the version of him she had understood, which he might not have understood about himself. She didn't regret leaving. That was the clearest thing. She had made the right choice at exactly the right moment, stayed 2 weeks longer than she probably should have, left with more grace than was required, and protected herself in the exact moment protecting herself became necessary. She was proud of that. She carried it as evidence of something she'd always needed to believe about herself, that when it came down to it, she would choose her own dignity. But not regretting a choice is different from not missing what came before it. She missed the version of the work she'd done when she still believed something was possible. She missed him if she was honest, and she was always with herself. Not the man who hadn't seen her. The man she'd understood him to be underneath that. She missed the potential. And missing potential is one of the longer griefs, because it has no definite object and no clear endpoint and tends to visit at inopportune moments with no warning. Priya said, "You're allowed to be sad and also know you did the right thing." Maya said, "I know." Priya said, "You also don't have to pretend it didn't matter." Maya said nothing for a long time. Then, "It mattered more than I ever said." Priya didn't push. That was why Maya loved her. She just sat with it. She saw him 6 weeks after she left. She was coming out of a coffee shop on Meridian Street, not paying particular attention to anything, and he was walking toward her on the same side of the sidewalk, and for 3 full seconds, before either of them processed what was happening, they were just 2 people about to pass each other in a city of millions. Then recognition landed. She stopped. He stopped. A full 6 feet of sidewalk between them and a quality of silence that the surrounding street noise somehow couldn't fill. He looked different. She noticed it immediately, in the specific way you notice a difference in someone you have studied closely. Not dramatically different, not changed in any theatrical way, just quieter. Held differently. Less armored, somehow, without being less confident. Like someone who had put something heavy down and was still learning to walk without the counterweight. He said her name. Just that. Not Miss Chen, not her surname the way he'd always used professionally. Her name is the way a person says a name they've said privately to themselves many more times than they've ever said it out loud. "Maya," she said. "Hello, Mr. Cole." Because she wasn't ready to close the distance in his direction. Because closing it would require trusting something she hadn't yet decided to trust. "Ethan," he said quietly. "Please, Something moved in her chest. Small. Barely a shift. But she felt it. They stood on that sidewalk for 7 minutes. They talked about almost nothing. The neighborhood, the weather, and whether the new transit line had actually improved commute times. The conversation was thin as paper, and underneath it was everything that had ever happened between them and everything that hadn't, and both of them could feel the weight of what wasn't being said pressing against every sentence they offered instead. When she said she had to go, he nodded immediately. He didn't press. He didn't linger. He said, "It was good to see you," and she believed, reading his face, that it was the truest thing he had said in a very long time. She walked away. She didn't look back. But 2 blocks later, she stopped and stood on the sidewalk and breathed for a moment because something had shifted, barely, slightly, the way tectonic plates shift before anyone knows it's happening, and she needed a moment to figure out whether it was something or nothing. She decided it was too early to know. 2 weeks after the sidewalk, a mutual colleague mentioned Ethan Cole at lunch. Not pointedly. Not with any sense of connecting it to Maya's history. Just as news, the way you pass along something surprising about someone, the table knows. Apparently, Ethan Cole had been seen doing volunteer work at a community health clinic in the Riverside district. Apparently, he'd been going for weeks. Nobody had a source. It was the kind of thing that gets around because it's so unexpected that people can't help mentioning it. Maya said nothing. She ate her lunch, listened, and kept her face completely neutral. Which was something she was very, very good at. Inside, something complicated was happening. She had thought, when she left, that his response to her absence would confirm what she already half believed about him. That she was replaceable, that the position would be filled within the month, that the machine would continue without her, and he would never once question why she had really gone. She had told herself this story because it was the version that made her own departure feel like a clean escape rather than an unresolved ending. Volunteer work at a clinic. The same kind of clinic where she spent her Saturdays. Where he had once stood in the window and watched her like someone confronting something he hadn't planned to confront. She didn't know what to do with this information. So she filed it carefully in the place she kept things she wasn't ready to interpret yet, and she went back to her afternoon, and she tried very hard not to give it more weight than it might deserve. But she thought about it that night. And the night after. And on Saturday afternoon at the clinic, when Mrs. Reyes told her she had finally gotten her benefits sorted out and the relief on the woman's face was so complete it was almost physical, Maya felt the fullness of that moment and then, immediately and without permission, thought about how a person who stood in a clinic window and felt shame might, over time, become someone who sat down inside it and tried to help. She thought people don't change easily. She had believed this for a long time. It was true enough as general principles go. But sometimes, rarely, not often, under specific conditions that usually involve genuine loss and genuine reckoning, sometimes they do. She thought, I don't know yet whether this is that. And that uncertainty, small as it was more than she'd allowed herself in months. He found her in a cafe on a Tuesday evening, which was not a collision this time. She had responded to his text, which he had sent after 3 drafts, which simply said, I know I have no right to ask. Coffee if you're willing. No pressure either way. She had looked at the text for a long time. She had not responded for 3 days. And then she wrote back, Tuesday. 6 o'clock. The place on Meridian, near where we ran into each other. She chose the location deliberately, the way she did everything deliberately, because neutral ground was important and that corner had already been the site of a genuine moment between them, and she wanted to build on genuineness rather than starting on unfamiliar terms. He was there when she arrived. 5 minutes early. She registered this, he was always exactly on time, never early, never late, punctuality being one of his control mechanisms, and she wondered what it meant that he was early now. Possibly nothing. Possibly he was nervous. The thought of Ethan Cole's nervousness was so novel that she sat down before she'd fully processed it. Thank you for coming, he said. You're welcome. She kept it simple. She was not going to make this easy for him, but she was not going to make it cruel either. He deserved the truth of her full attention. He didn't deserve management. He didn't try to explain himself right away. That surprised her. She had prepared, on the walk over, for a version of this conversation where he articulated a careful case, where he used the language of business to build a structure around what he was trying to say. He'd always been more comfortable with a constructed argument than exposed feelings. Instead, he said, "I've been thinking about what you said. That you needed my respect. I've been thinking about it since the day you said it, and I haven't been able to stop." She said nothing. She waited. "I don't know how to apologize for 3 years," he said. "I don't think sorry is a word that covers what I actually did, which was look at someone who was giving me everything they had and decide, without ever consciously deciding, that it didn't need to be acknowledged. That you didn't need to be seen." He looked at his hands. "I was wrong about everything. Most of all about you." She looked at him for a long moment. The city moved outside the window behind him. The cafe was warm and low-lit, and there was music she wasn't listening to. "Why now?" she asked. Not challenging him. Genuinely asking. She wanted to understand the interior geography of this, the specific moment when a person like Ethan Cole looks at himself clearly enough to say what he just said. He didn't answer immediately. She respected him for that, for not having a prepared answer, for sitting in the honest discomfort of the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Because I lost you," he said. "And losing you was the first thing that ever happened in my life that I couldn't optimize or redesign or work around. I couldn't make a better version of it. I couldn't run a process and fix the outcome. I just had to sit in what it actually was, which was something I caused, and it was terrible, and I needed it to be terrible because that was the only way I was going to understand what I had been doing." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I believe you." He looked up. Something moved in his face. "I'm not saying that means what you might want it to mean," she continued. "I'm saying I believe that you mean what you're saying. And that's different from where we were before, and I think it matters." He nodded. He didn't push. He didn't ask what comes next. He just sat with what she'd given him, which was acknowledgement, honest and limited, neither more nor less than the truth, and she watched him receive it without grasping for more, and that restraint told her more about his change than anything he'd said. They did not fall back into each other quickly. That was important. That was, in fact, the point. They had coffee twice more in the following weeks. Short meetings, no agenda, no weight on either end. He didn't try to reclaim the relationship they hadn't properly had. She didn't extend more than she was ready to give. They existed, instead, in a careful, deliberate in-between, two people feeling out whether the distance between where they'd been and where they might go was one they could actually cross. She learned things about him she hadn't known from 3 years of professional proximity, because the information he shared now was personal in a way he'd never allowed before. He told her about his father, who had built the company and who had never once told Ethan he was proud of him, and how chasing that silence across a career had shaped him into someone who believed approval was something you earned through performance and never something that arrived simply because you existed. He said this without using it as an excuse. He said it as fact, as context, and as the piece of the map that explained the territory. She told him in return things she had carried quietly for years. That she had loved working for him genuinely even when it was hardest. That the work had been some of the most challenging and intellectually engaging of her professional life. That she had stayed as long as she had not out of weakness but out of hope, and that leaving had not been the end of the hope, only the beginning of protecting herself while it still existed. He listened the way she had never seen him listen. Without processing what he would say next. Without managing toward a conclusion. Just taking in what she said with the full weight of his attention. The same attention he'd always reserved for contracts and strategy, and she felt for the first time, the experience of being genuinely received by him. Of her words landing and matching. Of being, in the most fundamental sense, seen. One evening at the clinic, she had returned on a Saturday. He was there on a Thursday. They hadn't coordinated it, but they both knew the other went. The director mentioned offhandedly to Maya that one of their anonymous donors had significantly increased the center's operational funding in the past month. New equipment in the examination room. A second intake coordinator is now on staff. The director didn't know who had done it. Maya did. She didn't say anything to him about it. She didn't need to. It wasn't a gesture aimed at her. That was the clearest proof it was real. It hadn't been done for her witness. He hadn't even told her. He'd simply done a good thing because he was trying to become the kind of person who does good things. Quietly. Without an audience. Without expectation of return. That was when she made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not a sweeping one. Just a quiet shift in the internal orientation that had been protecting her for 6 months. A slight opening of the door she'd kept firmly shut. Not wide. Not yet. But open. It was a Sunday evening in early December when they ended up in the park. The same park where he had interrupted her once 2 seasons ago and a world away. They had been walking near the neighborhood without planning to walk together, and then they were walking together, and it happened naturally enough that neither of them marked the exact moment it began. The city had the particular quiet of a Sunday night just before winter settles in completely. The lights on the path made circles on the ground. Their breath was just barely visible. She had her coat buttoned all the way up, her hands in her pockets. He walked beside her, not too close, not too far, an instinctive respect for the distance she'd needed for so long that the distance had become part of how he understood her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." He meant it. "That day in the office, when you locked the door." She paused. She had been carrying this question for months. "What were you going to say? Before the investors made it complicated, you ended up whispering it. What were you going to say?" He was quiet for a few steps. The gravel shifted under their feet. "I'd been watching you for weeks by then," he said. "Trying to understand what I was feeling, which I was very bad at. I'd just gotten out of a board meeting where they spent 40 minutes praising the quarter's results. And all I could think about was that you'd reorganized the entire reporting framework 3 months earlier, and you'd done it without being asked, and we'd had record clarity in every financial communication since, and nobody in that room knew it was you. And I looked around at all those people saying how well I'd done, and I thought she should be in this room. She should be hearing this. This is hers too." He stopped walking for a moment. "And then I thought, she has never once asked for that. In 3 years. She has never asked for credit, recognition, visibility, or anything. And I didn't know at first, whether that was just who she was or whether it was because she'd given up hoping I'd give it." "Both," Maya said quietly. "I know that now." He started walking again. "I locked the door because the investors were about to leave, and I realized I was about to let you leave the building that day without saying anything, which is what I'd done every day for 3 years. And I needed to not do that. Just for once. I needed to just say it." "Say what?" Her voice was careful. Steady. But her heart was doing the thing again. The stop and double that it had done that afternoon against the glass wall. He stopped. She stopped. They were facing each other on the path, the park light falling between them. "That I see you," he said. "That I have seen you, finally, and I am sorry it took me so long. And that you are extraordinary, not in the way I used to mean that word, which was transactional and about what you produced, but in the way that actually matters. In who you are. How you move through the world. What you give without keeping count. The way you loved something." He paused and his voice went quiet in a way that was different from all his other quietness. "The way you loved someone silently and completely when they gave you no reason to at all." She was not going to cry. She had decided this several months ago about any conversation involving him. She maintained it now barely. "You knew," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. Not at first. But yes. I knew." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know what to do with it, which is different. I kept telling myself it was my imagination or projection, or I was very committed to not knowing what I actually knew. Because knowing it meant I had to either act on it or acknowledge how completely I was failing to be worthy of it. And I wasn't ready for either of those things. And now, she asked it before she could decide not to. Now, he said, I'm not asking you to forgive me immediately or to come back to anything that looked like before. I'm just asking, if you're willing, to let me be someone who is actually here. Present. Someone who knows how to see you. The city hummed around them in the distance. A wind moved through the park and she let it, standing still inside it. People don't change easily, she said. She had said this before to herself many times. She said it now not as a wall but as the truth she was holding in her hands, examining it in this light. No, he agreed. They don't. But sometimes, she said slowly, when they finally understand what they've lost, the real thing, not the function it served them, sometimes they do. He didn't say anything. He let the sentence belong to her. She looked at him for a long time. And then she did something she hadn't done in over 6 months of guarding herself carefully. She took a step toward him. Just one. Deliberate. Chosen. Completely her own. And he didn't move, didn't rush to close the remaining distance, didn't reach for her, didn't do anything except stay exactly where he was and let her cross what was left on her own terms. Because he understood, finally, that this was how it had to be. That love doesn't begin with the person who realizes it. It begins with the person who earns it. They did not go back to before. Before, there had been a structure built on imbalance. Her giving, him receiving. Her visible, him blind. Before, there was no foundation anyone should build twice. They built something that had never existed between them. Something that required both of them to show up differently. Him to stay present and honest and humble about the distance he still had to travel. Her to stay open without abandoning the self-knowledge that had guided her through the hardest months. They were careful with each other in a way that would have looked, to an outside observer, almost slow. Unhurried. Deliberate. It was, in fact, exactly the right speed. He learned to sit with silence in a new way, not the silence of someone who considers conversation beneath him, but the silence of someone genuinely listening. The silence that says, I am here, and you have my whole attention, and whatever you choose to offer is worth my full consideration. She experienced this from him and felt it in her body the way you feel warmth after cold, not dramatically, not all at once, but as a gradual returning of something that had been absent for a very long time. She learned, in turn, to allow herself to need. This was the harder revision on her side. She had spent 3 years, and if she was honest, many years before him too, managing her needs into invisibility because showing them had always felt like giving someone leverage over something she couldn't afford to lose. Learning to say I want this and this matters to me and I need you to show up for this specifically was work. Uncomfortable, necessary work. He received those statements every time with the full weight of someone who understood exactly what it cost her to offer them. There were still hard conversations. There would always be. He still moved too fast sometimes, still defaulted to problem solving when she needed him to sit with her through the difficulty. She still went quiet sometimes when she should have spoken, still protected herself reflexively in moments when protection wasn't required. They were both still themselves, complicated and formed and carrying their respective histories. But they were both there, choosing to be there, returning to each other after every hard conversation instead of retreating into the separate fortresses where they'd each been living alone for so long. One evening, months later, in his apartment that had slowly become a space that felt like someone actually lived there, books she had left on the coffee table, a second coffee mug on the shelf, one of her sweaters on the back of the reading chair, she was sitting beside him in the quiet of a Sunday night that didn't need to be anything other than what it was. He had his arm around her. She had her head against his shoulder. The city was doing its quiet winter hum outside the window. She was almost asleep. He said softly so as not to fully wake her, "You're mine." Not a claim. Not a possession. The word, mine, the way you say it about something you are overwhelmingly grateful to have, carefully knowing that gratitude is the only appropriate response to something you came close to losing forever. She didn't answer. She was too close to sleep. But her hand, which had been resting in her lap, moved to find his and stayed there, and that was its own kind of answer. The kind that doesn't need words, the kind that exists beneath language, the kind that only two people who have been through the long and complicated road of genuinely seeing each other can share. She had loved him in silence for 3 years. She had protected herself by walking away. And now she was here, not because he was powerful, not because he had money or position or the ability to offer things other people couldn't. She was here because he had finally, irrevocably, completely learned how to see her. And because being truly seen by someone, after years of invisibility, is one of the most extraordinary things in the world. Some loves take a long time to become possible. Some loves require someone to fail first, to lose what matters most, and to sit in the uncomfortable silence of their own worst self until they understand what they were missing. Those loves, when they finally arrive, carry a weight and a warmth that easier loves never quite reach, because they were built, painstakingly, on the ruins of something that had to fall before anything real could be raised in its place. This is one of those loves. If you saw yourself somewhere in this story, if you've ever loved someone in silence or been unseen by someone you gave everything to, or had to walk away from something you wanted to keep, leave a comment. Tell us where you are and what you felt. Because you are not alone in this. And stories like this exist to remind you of exactly that. Subscribe if this reached you and come back, because the next story is already waiting.